Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you for that welcome. It's wonderful to be here in Denver, wonderful to be with you and at the Western Conservative Summit. I appreciate those kind words of introduction by Don Sweeting. I'm so thankful for him and for Colorado Christian University and the leadership they're showing not only in this area, but throughout the world. I'm thankful for an event like this. It encourages me to know that there are folks like you willing to give a few days of your time for ideas like these. And that's what brings us together, and for that I am just so thankful. Our concern with this gathering is the assault on religious liberty now experienced within the United States and throughout Western civilization. The very civilization that paid an incalculable price through the centuries in order to defend and preserve human rights and human liberty now grows hostile to the most basic liberty of all. History's most courageous experiment in self-government, predicated upon unalienable rights, now seeks to alienate the unalienable. The cultural left in the United States now dares to use the term religious liberty only in scare quotes. How did this happen? I believe that most conservatives in the United States have vastly underestimated the reality and comprehensiveness of the challenge that we now face. We see parts, we all do, but it takes concentrated attention, a devotion to history, and a serious reckoning with ideas to see the whole, the vastness of our crisis. We see religious liberty denied when a cake baker in Colorado experiences sustained efforts to put him out of business or worse, accompanied nationwide by florists and photographers and a host of others. We see the fire chief of Atlanta, Georgia, lose his job because he dared to uphold a biblical standard of sexual morality and to teach it in his church and to put it in print. That's now impossible for someone who would be the fire chief of Atlanta, Georgia. We see Christian schools and ministries confront unprecedented challenges across several fronts, and we see a continual effort to coerce Christians to surrender to the new regime of sexual rules, gender identity, intersectionality, and identity politics. The enemies of religious liberty are playing hardball, and we were warned. Chai Feldblum, formerly of Georgetown University Law Center and later appointed by President Barack Obama to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, over a decade ago admitted in a public statement that religious liberty would have to give way to the new sexual or erotic liberty. This new sexual liberty was invented by moral revolutionaries. It was enshrined by the United States Supreme Court and is now used as a weapon of cultural and legal warfare. Then, looking to the day when same-sex marriage would be legalized and religious liberty would be inevitably denied or redefined, Chai Feldblum said this, quote, "I'm having a hard time coming up with any case in which religious liberty should win. Sexual liberty should win in most cases. There can be a conflict between religious liberty and sexual liberty, but in almost all cases, sexual liberty should win because that's the only way that the dignity of gay people can be affirmed in any realistic manner," end quote. We can't say we weren't told because she told us before it happened, a decade before it happened. In oral arguments before the Supreme Court of the United States, President Obama's Solicitor General, Donald Verrilli, when asked if the legalization of same-sex marriage might require a Christian college to be coerced into compliance on the question, for example, of married student housing, the Solicitor General responded candidly, "It will be an issue. Indeed, it will. It will be an issue for every Christian school, for every Christian college or university. It will be an issue for every Christian in the professions, in business, in public service, in uniform. It will be an issue for all of us, and it will particularly be an issue for our children and their children and their children's children." Denis Diderot, the philosopher of radical enlightenment, once infamously stated, "Man will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest." The agents of coercive secularism evidently believe that the American public will not be safe until the last religious symbol is pried off of the last square inch of public property. They lost their challenge to the Peace Cross in Bladensburg, Maryland a few weeks ago, but they will be back. Rest assured of that. Every vestige of Christianity, every single symbol of theism, it is something that haunts and infuriates a culture, especially the elites of the culture, who deny God, and they are determined to erase his memory. How did this happen? Tonight, I want to make a simple argument. Basically, it comes down to 3 words. I think it's an essential argument. I want to argue that we cannot understand our stewardship of religious liberty without 3 essential words. Those 3 words: God, truth, and liberty. And in that order. There can be no lasting defense of religious liberty without understanding how these 3 words hold together and in what order. First, God. Professor Robbie George tonight mentioned Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He mentioned the very same speech given in 1983. I want to put that quote by Solzhenitsyn into context. He said, "Men have forgotten God. That's why all this happened." But just before that, he said he could remember old people in Russia explaining the disasters that befell Russia, later the Soviet Union in the 20th century. And he said he could remember old people in Russia explaining those disasters by saying, "Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened." I was a very young man when I first heard that, and I can remember thinking, yes, that is true in Russia. But ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, the problem is that's now true in the United States of America. Men have forgotten God, and that's why all this has happened. We're living in an age of accelerating secularization. The causes and courses of this secular motion are debatable, but the essential truth is beyond question. Belief in God, any belief in God, is in eclipse. This is especially true among the intellectual elites and the cultural creatives. Decades ago, Yale law professor Stephen Carter argued that the intellectual elites had reduced God to a symbol and religion to a hobby. But now those same elites see God as a dangerous symbol and religion as a scandalous hobby. Consider the statement made by Frank Bruni, columnist for the New York Times. He said that religious liberty is okay. We're going to have to tolerate religious liberty, he said, to the readers of the New York Times, so long as religious people keep their religious beliefs to their hearts and their homes and their pews, so long as it has no public significance. But ladies and gentlemen, that's not religious liberty. That's the denial of religious liberty. If you can only believe and teach and advocate and preach and live out what you believe in your heart or in your home or in your house of worship, that's not religious liberty. But that is exactly how it's being redefined. Also, a little footnote here. Notice how successive administrations, especially the Obama administration, redefined religious liberty as freedom of worship. In other words, keep it in your church, it's okay, just don't bring it out. The Declaration of Independence, our most foundational national charter, spoke of the laws of nature and nature's God. We should not overread this statement, but we dare not underread it. The founders claimed an authority higher than themselves and natural rights and liberties that were pre-political, pre-constitutional, pre-governmental, and prior to our own respect. When belief in God recedes, the only secure ground of human rights and human dignity recedes as well. Solzhenitsyn had it right. You ask how this happened? Men have forgotten God. That's how all this has happened. Natural rights cannot survive without understanding that natural rights have a supernatural origin. God has revealed such rights in nature, accessible to all, but men who will not acknowledge God eventually will not acknowledge those rights, the rights that God has revealed. Human nature is the explanation for how human beings can look to nature and understand. But human nature is defined by the fact that we are every single one of us, made in God's image. We are not merely natural. The second word is truth. I believe this word might actually be the most neglected of the essential vocabulary of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Every one of these words demands our rapt attention, but don't move too quickly over the word truths. They didn't say merely values or opinions, truth. A defense of religious liberty and all other self-evident liberties is predicated upon an assertion of truth, not mere opinion. The worldview that will alone sustain liberty is a worldview that is established upon a defense of truth, the objective existence of reality and the necessary correspondence of statement and objective truth. Why would we now expect an academic and elite culture, pervasively shaped by postmodern notions of truth, to defend religious liberty? If objective reality does not exist, or if it cannot be known, then politics is just reduced to what Harvard professor Mary Ann Glendon calls rights talk. Politics collapses into nothing more than an endless succession of battles over contested rights. I remember as a teenager when I first read Francis Schaeffer, and that great Christian thinker and apologist said that eventually Christians would have to be very clear that we don't just believe in truth, we believe in true truth. It should be ridiculous to have to say true truth, but most people in our society think that truth is a compliment you've paid to an idea. We believe that it's true because it's true. And if you don't believe that truth exists, you won't believe that inalienable rights exist. There is no truth, then there is certainly no self-evident truth, and the foundation of the American experiment in liberty, including religious liberty, disappears. The third word is liberty. The first word, God. The second, truth. The third, liberty. The founders not only asserted truth claims, they defended liberties. They didn't use that word by accident. Liberties. They went further to argue that the proper function of government is to secure these rights. To secure them, not to invent them, not to grant them, nor to create them, or even to discover them. Instead, the function of government is to secure rights and liberties that pre-exist the government and pre-exist the state. Religious freedom is truly the first freedom, for without this prior freedom, all others become fragile and contingent. As a Christian theologian, I'll insist that the only true grounding of our first liberty is in the very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible. The book of Genesis tells us that God created human beings in his own image, each a living soul. Human dignity is grounded in the loving and glorious creation of the self-existent, omnipotent, all-glorious God who revealed himself perfectly, incarnationally in Jesus Christ, verbally in the Holy Scriptures, and clearly even in the structures of creation. We owe every human being created in God's image the full recognition of human dignity and the sacredness of every human life, including life in the womb. And make no mistake, these issues are not unrelated. The right to life and the right to exercise liberty, including religious freedom, these are deeply related. It is no accident that a society that devalues life in the womb will also devalue religious liberty. If we are just cosmic accidents and there is no inherent meaning to our lives, then there's no sacredness to human life, any human life, and liberty is just another word for my preference over yours. The eclipse of the biblical worldview makes every arena of life deadly and dangerous, from the womb to the classroom to the courtroom. God, truth, and liberty. We need to discipline ourselves to say these words together, always to say them together. We must teach them to our children and to our neighbors. We must cherish them in our schools and in our homes, and teach them in our churches. The great challenge to religious liberty in our times, it's not any threat to liberal religion. Those churches and denominations have long ago surrendered to the moral revolutionaries, and they simply don't believe anything sufficiently biblical or theological to get any of them into trouble. They can afford to put quotation marks around religious liberty because they'd already put quotation marks around God. We must defend the right to believe in enough theology to get us into trouble, and to get us into trouble with anyone, anywhere in a secular age. We must defend the right of Christians, along with all other believers, to be faithful in the public square as in the privacy of our own homes, in our hearts, and yes, in our churches. We must defend the right to teach our children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. We must defend the rights of Christian schools to be Christian and order our institutions around the Word of God without fearing the crushing power of the state. We must defend the right of generations of those yet unborn to know the liberties we have known and now defend. Oddly enough, who knew that in our time that would mean defending florists and cake bakers and fire chiefs and pharmacists and teachers and preachers and moms and dads who dare to resist the powers that be? For Christians, eventually it all comes down to our faithfulness in preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ and nurturing biblical churches and raising our own children in the grace of God. Remember this: no God, no truth, no truth, no liberty, and nothing remains but the heel of someone's boot. Those who signed the Declaration of Independence pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Sacred honor. How dare we pledge to one another and to our posterity anything less? Remember this. Liberty depends upon the existence of truth. Truth depends upon the existence of God. No God, no truth, no liberty, no human rights, no human dignity, no sanctity of life. But God is not dead. Truth is not a dream. And liberty is ours to defend. May God give us grace and wisdom in the fulfillment of this great task. God bless you.